In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the sequencing capabilities through some of the modules on the Eventide hardware. I've seen drawn to step sequencing, where per step you're changing a parameter for another module, and maybe I've done it for the delay, where step 1 is 20 milliseconds, the next one is 30, then 15, and that creates like a nice melodic resonance. One of the very first algorithms I started building was this granular sampler. Well, that's what I'm calling it, but there's no granular synthesis on the H9000, no specific granular module, but you can kind of mimic some of these things using delay samplers. They're based on delay memory. It's kind of like the type of thing used for a looper, so it could record it into memory and then you can play it back at different speeds, reverse, etc. But basically once you power that down or reload the preset, all those samples are gone. It's just going to be reading in whatever input's coming in and then record, play it back based on your parameters, but you can still do some fun stuff with that. So I'll play you an example here. I'm just playing you the dry signal here first. Now I'm going to turn it on. So what you've got here is essentially these 8 different samplers, and they're recording just a little snippet of audio and it's playing back a little bit later. So here you can see sampler 1 and 5 and the settings, okay, and then sampler 2 and 6 and 3 and 7 and 4 and 8, for example. So in this case, I've only got sampler 1 and 5 set to record and play back. Well, actually they're all recording, but I'm only setting these ones to play back, and then 3 and 7. And then, there's easy taps, which I'm sending it through to give you some of these cool funky sounds. Additionally, there's an ADSR that I set up, which is assigned to sampler 7, and you can basically set attack and decay. You're hearing that when this one says play here. So that cool effect is done by the ADSR, changing the endpoint in the sampler during a looping sequence. Let me show you what I'm doing there. I'm not going to be going into everything about what's going on here. I'm just going to start with the sequencing capabilities, and if you guys are interested in anything else here, then we can talk about it. Over here, I'm using a sequence count module. I'm feeding that an LFO in a square wave into a one-shot module, and then that goes into the sequence count. You can ignore the switch. This is just to disable the counting or to enable it. A lot of the stuff here you see is for some other added functionalities, but most basically you just need the LFO into one shot, into sequence count, and then that's going into various modules over here where it's checking which value it's on. I'm going to take us into a different Vsig document to show you how that all works. But in this case, the sequencer is then telling sampler 1 to record, and then later it's telling the sampler 1 to play back. And that's what a lot of these modules are over here. Quite simply, what we've got here is an LFO going into the one shot, going into a seqcount, seqcount. And then this is basically a bridge module. This module converts an audio signal into a control signal, and then we can output that into a monitor, or it can be received by pretty much any control based module. So in this case over here, I'm multiplying it by 8. So I'm taking the sequencer value and I'm multiplying it by 8 and then outputting that to a monitor as well. And these are going into menu pages. Down here, I'm doing another one with a switch, and then monitoring that, and then taking this output into a sequencer, and then outputting that, and we'll see the differences between all these. So I think basically what you're seeing here is we've got some green, and we've got some blue, we've got some pinkish, and what we've got here is control signals versus audio signals. And it's quite important to point this out. So the H9000 works, well, actually all the Eventide stuff, and even actually Reactor from Native Instruments. When you're creating an algorithm, you'll have a control rate where you can set the speed of that processor. Then you'll have the DSP, which is pretty much reserved for the audio rate stuff. on the H9000 there's control rate and there's audio rate. Okay, audio rate is where things work and process at the sample rate of the audio, whatever the box is set to, and then control rate is going to happen much slower, and there's kind of no guarantees about when a control signal will arrive or when it's going to be processed, etc. So certain things you want to process at the audio rate and other things are okay to be processed at the control rate. I've done quite a few things at control rate and it's been absolutely fine. So like my delay sequencer that I created, that was pretty much done, some parts of it at audio rate and then other parts of it done at control rate. And it was absolutely fine. I guess it's only when you're trying to do stuff that's super quick, then, you know, counting samples or, you know, if you want to do a compressor and you want to have really fast attack and release times, being able to make the decision on how you're applying those values. So you want to do those calculations at audio rate. And additionally, actually, there's another type of module, which is the oscillators. So, well, actually not the oscillators, the LFOs work at 1/4 of the audio rate, so 0.25 of whatever the sample rate is, and that's fine for doing things like tremolos, etc. And then you also have oscillators like the H9000 oscillator, etc. These ones which are actually audio rate based oscillators. So you don't really need to use these for modulation, but you can, but they're a bit more CPU intensive. And you can use these to actually create synthesizers, etc. So let me talk through this. What we've got here is the LFO. This is basically at 1/4 of the audio rate. And what I've set it to is wave 2. Now if we open up the docs, you'll see that wave 2 is square. So I've set that up to be a square. I've set the polarity to be 0. Okay, and then I'm outputting it into a one-shot. And what the one-shot is going to do is, because an LFO, a square wave, it's going to stay high for quite a period of time, well, half the time of the cycle. So if you have, you know, 1 hertz, which is 1 cycle a second, for half a second, the LFO square wave is going to stay at 1, and then it's going to go down to 0. So what the one shot does is once it crosses that threshold that you set here at 0.5, as soon as that square wave goes below 0.5 and then above again, it's going to trigger the one shot. And the one shot is just going to output an impulse, and in this case it's configured to 10 milliseconds. Okay, and that could be less. And then sequence count is then set up for 8 steps. There's a threshold here as well, so if you just set these kinds of things at 0.5, you're pretty much fine. Additionally, this also has a polarity where it can go basically 0 to 1, or it could go -1 to +1. Okay, and then this is the bridge module, which converts audio into control signal so that we can plug it into control modules and monitor these signals, etc. Okay, all right, so let's push this up. Right, so here you go. You'll see that we've got the frequency, the LFO frequency set to 1, and seqcount, which is basically this out to the control, the bridge, out to this monitor, that is counting at 0. It's going to start at 0 in a second. Okay, 0, 125, 250, etc. So what's important about audio rate stuff is it works between the values of -1 to 1 or 0 to 1. Okay, so when you're setting up the sequence, if you created a 16 steps, then that between 0 and 1 is going to be divided by 16, and then you'll see the smaller values as it increments. Then what I'm doing here is once I've converted it into a control rate, I put it into a multiply module, a control rate multiply module, and I'm multiplying it by 8, and then putting that into a monitor, and then you can see this is basically 1, 2, 3. So that is useful if I want to output that value into a control rate module and do changes like that. Okay, and then what I've done here then is I've taken this multiply, which is multiplied by 8, and I've put it into a switch. Okay, now switch being control rate, it doesn't really have those limits between -1 and 1. I mean, even an audio signal can go greater than 1. That's not what this is about. Just generally these modules, audio rate works within 0 to 1, whereas a switch, you know, this could have output any value. So if you want to output 20 kilohertz from a switch over here, you can set that to 20,000. So the maximum you can send out is 32,767, which should suffice. Okay. So then you can basically output that into the monitor and then into a menu page, and what you'll see here is this. Okay, now this is essentially outputting in that switch point 0, then 1, then 2, then 3. Now it's just counting up because that's what I put in this, but we can go and change these. Push that now. Now you'll see these values are changing based on whatever values are set within the switch. Okay, so now we're at 10, then we're 200, -3, 45, 55, 6, 7. So you could use that to sequence certain parameters, like maybe a delay parameter or maybe you know, certain modulation values. But there's other ways to do modulation using audio rate stuff. And if you're finding that the control signal isn't necessarily fast enough for what you want to achieve, then you can by all means rather use an audio rate module. Then another audio rate sequencer based option is to output seqcount, which is essentially just doing the counting, and then it's going to plug that into the sequencer. In the sequencer, you set how many steps you want. You tell it what full scale is, and in this case we're just going to 1. And the input is the clock from seqcount, so it is this value over here. So we're outputting that into the sequencer. Okay, so because we're going to have 8 steps here, once again this is going to be 1 divided by 8, which is going to give you your steps, and you have to minus one of those values because 0 is the first one. It's the same thing for seqcount. Even though I've got that set to 8, it's actually going to go from 0 to 7, and sequencer works in the same way. So the sequencer, then you can plug in different control values here to set these values. You can set those dynamically, you can set it through a UI. So it's quite a nice way to do modulation values, which are typically between 0 and 1. But the important thing is it's going to output an audio rate signal. And that audio rate signal, meaning it's being triggered by an audio rate signal, and it's going to output at that audio rate, meaning you can do really fast modulations at the sample rate. Okay, once you convert that into a control signal, so we can monitor it and then we can put it into a menu page. And then down here is where you're going to see that. So we're going to go from 0 to 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and it has to be between 0 and 1. So it's quite nice for those types of values. Okay, so between 0 and 1, which is typically what modulation would be. So I hope that makes sense. I don't want to make this one too overly complicated, and if you think that's useful and you want to dive more into some of the other capabilities, we can do that.